I really like seeing military aircraft in historical fiction, especially from the Second World War era. I grew up watching a lot of military history series and movies heavily featuring cool airplanes shooting each other and dropping bombs on stuff. I had a lot of toy planes, and I spent many hours on some plane-focused video games, and so I developed a taste for the aesthetics of military aircraft. Same thing with warships and tanks, and on top of this, I have a level of nostalgia for these military vehicles because they were a big part of my childhood. More recently, I have also developed a love for 2D animation, and so seeing these aircraft rendered in this style activates my neurons in a special kind of way. However, my love for 2D animation inevitably leads me to anime, of which many must-watch classics require the context of the Japanese perspective of the Second World War as subtext, or directly cover that perspective in the plot itself. And these pieces of art certainly don't portray the American instruments of war in the same light as the History Channel action series that barely qualify as documentaries I watched as a kid. My reflexive nostalgic love for images of military aircraft, then, creates an involuntary clash of feelings whenever I watch historical pieces that involve these planes from the opposite point of view. And nowhere have I felt this clash more than when watching Grave of the Fireflies. There's a lot of cool planes in this movie. The Hellcats, the P-51 Mustang, the B-29s. So many B-29s. I would be lying if I said my eyes don't light up a little anytime they appear on screen, rendered in stellar illustrated artwork and a few times in incredibly smooth motion. It's not something I can really control when I grew up seeing them as cool, especially from the American perspective in which they are, in a way, heroes of the war, extremely important in the eventual Allied victory, and now I get to see them in an art form I've grown extremely fond of. But at the same time, I know what they're doing, and I see the results of their actions. They're shooting at civilians and bombing cities. They turn Seita and Setsuko's mom into the charred, rotting corpse permanently seared into my mind. They create a constant atmosphere of terror, and because of them, and the war at large, we see these children slowly starve and die. I am forced to be terrified of something I have a strong connection to, and that makes me realize even deeper the extent to which the planes which I played with as toys or watched on the TV like they were my favorite characters in an action show were used to cause such immense destruction and suffering, both in the random acts of violence of individuals and the cruel, calculated bombing campaigns approved by military commanders. It doesn't just challenge my aesthetic enjoyment of the aircraft or my deep-rooted conception of them as kind of heroes of the war, but it makes me question some common narratives around the war itself. I find myself trying to ease my mind, telling myself that we had to do this. We had to do this to end the war. But did we? Did we really? How much more suffering would have made it end faster? How much longer would the war have been if we inflicted less suffering, sent less corpses to the mass graves, scarred fewer minds? There's a part of me that wants to challenge the movie on if some of these things really happened. Like, there's no logical reason for these fighter planes to be randomly strafing civilians. Would they really do that in real life? But I know it's true to life. The crimes committed by the Imperial Japanese military were far, far worse and in much greater number, but you can still look over a list of all the violence committed by the Allies on the Japanese considered bad even at the time. And that's if Grave of the Fireflies isn't already convincing. The movie is only fantastical when occasionally framing itself as the ghosts of the dead children looking back on their suffering. The first time we see a bombing, it's strikingly not dramatic. In broad daylight, a handful of flaming metal rods fall from the sky. For a good 30 seconds or so, they don't even seem to be that dangerous. They just sit there in the street for Seita to stare at. Before the fires really break out and we see the entire city burning, the apparent lack of exaggeration actually sells us on the reality of the situation, that we're going to witness what it was really like to live through an air raid. I remember reading about these incendiary bombs in a book I got from my elementary school library and thinking they sounded awesome. I could imagine them pouring out of the bombers and spreading fire on the city below, but that book didn't prompt me to think about the innocent people on the ground racing for shelter. I've seen footage of bombs being dropped, I've imagined them hitting their targets, but only from a dehumanizing height far above the ground. Most of the movie is devoid of music, with a muted color palette, and shots that seem to linger for just a bit too long on every image of the devastated landscape. It's a clear standout from the rest of the Studio Ghibli catalog, filled with deliberate choices to emphasize the reality of the story, reminding us that it draws on the lived experience of the creators. I know that Hayao Miyazaki has said some of his earliest memories are of bombed out cities. His longtime friend and collaborator, Isao Takahata, who directed this film, lived through the same war and was even older than Miyazaki at the time. The author of the original short story based it directly on his own experiences surviving fire bombings and famine, and the lifelong guilt he held after the death of his own younger sister to starvation. So, I know these planes contributed to the immense suffering of the Japanese people. I know B-29s were the same bombers that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that they killed even more civilians across Japan in firebombing raids like the ones we see in this movie. I know that even this old biplane was probably used to train Japanese pilots as they helped build their fascist empire. That Seita's father's ship probably sank only after inflicting as much suffering as it could on the Americans in a hopeless war. And and this lone kamikaze that Zeta spots probably went down killing its pilot and a handful of American sailors in a pointless act of terroristic violence, all cause the Japanese high command couldn't swallow their pride and surrender until it was too late for these kids. But are these instruments of war still cool to me? I think so. I don't think they can't be. To me, no matter the context, I'm always gonna have that subtle aesthetic pleasure. Why do I think this clash is important to talk about? We have a lot of good war stories nowadays, ones that construct truly complex narratives around the reasons we lead ourselves into conflict. And it's good that we have those, because there are many deep philosophical ideas which push us into war, and it's good to try to understand them. But not every human's reasoning is so based in extensive critical thinking. People more often decide on things for shallow reasons, even simpler than a desire for revenge or safety, despite how serious the consequences might be. And when it comes to the military or war, or really anything involving violence, people can support the most consequential of actions for the most shallow of reasons. Sometimes people just think nuking a city, expanding territory on a map, or carpet bombing a nation sounds awesome. A sense of strength and power overrides any possible recognition of humanity on the other side. When I was in 2nd grade, the Syrian civil war was happening. I remember it was on the news, and a family member who was watching next to me said that what we needed to do was carpet bomb the entire Middle East. Sometimes we can fail to connect these cool things to the uncool consequences. We think about the situation from too high up, unable to see the humanity of the people who would be affected, and allowing ourselves to be driven by an immature reflex to choose the thing that sounds the most awesome. A film like Grave of the Fireflies, even with the context of a war in which one side definitely needs to win over the other, breaks the barrier between epic military force and the actual human consequences of that, showing that it's possible to wage a just war less ethically than possible. When we view things from the ground rather than from the air, we realize that what might sound cool is obviously not moral. And that's important, because in order to be our best selves, we have to think about why we want to do the things we want to do, and why we believe the things we do. How much does our position come from thinking something is just cool to us, or some other shallow reason, rather than an actual fair examination of how it affects ourselves and other people? Sometimes we need something to slap us in the face and remind us to re-examine ourselves. So maybe I can live with the aesthetic clash I feel while watching Grave of the Fireflies. I can think these death machines are cool while still recognizing the pain they caused in reality. I can enjoy the aesthetics of military technology without supporting unnecessary violence, without ceasing to be critical of military action, or the military-industrial complex, I think. Maybe I'm deluding myself, trying to hold on to something I enjoy and have nostalgia for. I know the dissonance will fuck me up every time I see a movie like this, but I also know that my moral decisions and what I politically support in the world are not determined by aesthetics. I realized long before I saw this movie the frequent clash between aesthetics and proper ethics. It was once a battle in me to choose between good actions and cool planes. It is not a battle for me anymore. I have chosen to support what I think is right and good over what I thought looked cool when I was 8. It's not something I feel divided on anymore. Just a slight awkward feeling sometimes, watching the planes that I still love to look at cause such devastation and suffering. And I'm reminded of it whenever I see people who haven't gone down the same path as me, who still uncritically support military efforts over efforts to increase human well-being, who support supposed strength and coolness over what is truly good. It makes me wonder how they would feel about the cool airplanes in Grave of the Fireflies.